We are here in London, and Tom Sunic has been speaking at patriotic and nationalist meetings. He's been very good of Tom to put himself out, to travel over here to the United Kingdom. Some of us in the United Kingdom are familiar with Tom Sunic's books. Here is one of his books, Post-Mortem Report, which was purchased by myself 2 years ago perhaps, and I have met Tom once or twice before when he's come over to the United Kingdom and spoken at patriotic and nationalist meetings. But this is our guest, Tom Sunic, Tomislav Sunic. Tom, welcome to the United Kingdom.
Thank you.
You are active in American politics. Can you tell us something about your activism, your support of, and I believe your membership of A3P, the American Third Party?
Mm-hmm. Okay, well, real briefly, American Third Party position is just a relatively new party in the American political spectrum or environment, and basically the agenda of the A3P is similar to the agenda of the National Front here in the UK. We certainly are against banksters, or gangsters as we call them nowadays. We are against this financial capitalism and this massive foreclosures and this financial fraud, if I can put it quite bluntly, going on in the United States of America. And one of the reasons we launched this party is that precisely we want to reach out to average Americans of European ancestry, and basically our message goes to white Americans, to European Americans, because we would like to, exactly what I was talking about today, we want to help them get rid of this complex of guilt, of those guilt feelings, and we want them to be proud of their origin, not just of their racial origin, because as I said a while ago in my speech, this term race has been so much abused and misused that it doesn't mean nothing nowadays, except for our detractors and enemies. But we want them to be culturally aware, to resuscitate their implicit whiteness, as my friend Kevin MacDonald, who is also on the board of the committee, who's the member of the A3P, we want them also to formulate their explicit whiteness, that they can be proud of who they are, that they can say openly in public, look, we are American, Europeans, we are proud of our heritage, and let's stop with this endless demonization of the white American people. So we can see again the great deal of similarities between what's going on in the UK with the white people who constantly have to self-efface them, so to speak, who constantly have to push themselves, if I can use the metaphoric word, who need to use this self-castrating language in order to normally survive in this country. And in terms of some technicalities, yes, I need to mention the name of Mr. Merlin Miller. He's a very fine gentleman. He's a friend of mine. He's our presidential candidate, and he should actually, well, as I said, now we have upcoming elections, the presidential elections in November in the United States of America. I doubt that we are going to make any major breakthroughs, but we are known. His name is known. As far as his background is concerned, he's a filmmaker, very successful man, good-looking very man also, and he's a West Point graduate, and he's a good speaker, and well, I can also say he's a good character.
So, if I can pick up on that point, your candidate in the current presidential elections in the United States of America, your candidate Merlin Miller, yeah.
Yes, exactly. Merlin Miller.
Yeah, was a former, is a military man, West Point.
Yes, he used to be, right, West Point, yes.
Really, that is something.
And precisely, he has some contacts, and again, it's hard for me to speculate about what may happen and what may not happen, but we certainly do have many sympathizers in the United States of America who are certainly not very explicit about their sympathetic nature towards us, but they are definitely get the message that we're getting across.
You say that for the American Third Party, you have many sympathizers.
Yes.
How do you go about promoting your ideas and your ideals? You've mentioned that you have a candidate in these presidential elections. Mm-hmm. In general, how do you go about promoting your ideas and your ideals amongst the American people?
All right, now we have scheduled conferences and speeches. As a matter of fact, we have the upcoming big convention in Tennessee, in the mid-October. I guess it's the 14th of October, 15th October, and I will be there with my speech, more or less of a theoretical nature, like the one I just had for the National Front, where I'll be discussing about race and nationalism and the flooding of America by aliens and by different groups. And this is just one of the events. Just the other day, our friend and our presidential candidate Merlin Miller, he was a speaker at this the Council of Conservative Citizens, which is another group in the United States of America. As I said, this is not a biggie, but still we are moving ahead. We are making some niches, so to speak, or loopholes. We're nesting, so to speak, our message, and especially with younger audience. We don't have many people as far as our activism is concerned, but certainly people from different nationalist groups are aware of our existence, and all the more as that's probably it goes to our advantage. Unlike any other party in the United States of America, our board of committee is literally made up of top-notch academics and intellectuals.
Since you're a top-notch academic professor, I asked you how you promote your ideas and your ideals, and clearly the answer to that, in part, is that you are the author of a number of books, yes?
Right.
I'd like to ask you, if you would, to give a brief summary of the thrust of the ideas in your book, Against Equality and Democracy.
All right. Let me first answer to the first segment of your question. The only way nowadays, we live in very, very unusual times, the only way you can succeed with your political message is through the cultural struggle. And this is something where we have to learn, and where we learned with the American 33rd position, because I'm in charge of this, what we call cultural battle, cultural struggle, Kulturstruggle, or Kulturkampf as the Germans call it. You have, prior to capturing the ballots, prior to catching the votes, you have to catch the mindset and the minds of people, especially young people. You have to infuse and instill the ideas, the dominant ideas, into their mind. And how to do that? The best way to do it, of course, by presenting yourself as a role model, and of course by showing a certain arsenal of knowledge and scholarship. This is how you can appeal to the audience. So we're not serving ourselves, and I can tell you that with all due respect for a lot of people, that we are doing that on a really literally voluntary basis, and I'm very proud of it, because we don't have character problems, we don't have ego problems within our rank and file. So again, as far as the first segment of your question is concerned, cultural battle or cultural struggle is the most important thing nowadays, before you want to reach the threshold of palace. So in other words, let me use another figure of speech. Before you want to walk into the White House, or for that matter, before you want to walk into the Westminster, you have to prepare the terrain of dominant political ideas. You have to create the Marxists call it cultural hegemony. And this is something we got to learn very, very much from Marxists, who actually have captured, who have kidnapped our speech, our public discourse, when they have been so apt in brainwashing, particularly younger people and particularly students in higher education. I'm sorry about the second segment of your... Against Democracy and Equality, believe it or not, this was my doctoral dissertation in 1987, when I got my PhD in the United States of America, the University of California, Santa Barbara. It's a very descriptive book. It's not a pamphlet. It's heavily footnoted book, where I'm dealing with the phenomenon known as the European New Right. Despite the fact that I'm not happy with this expression, because it creates different, it actually lends itself to different interpretations. It may have different connotations and meanings in different political cultures. But what I'm basically doing in this book, I'm reviewing the authors who can be vaguely cataloged as cultural, revolutionary, conservative thinkers. Well, you can think, for instance, about, just crossed my mind, Roger Scruton, for instance. I think I mentioned him there. Or you can think about D.H. Lawrence. Okay, here is probably a person who he never qualified himself as a revolutionary conservative, but in terms of his temperament, in terms of his sensibility, D.H. Lawrence would fit into that. Crowley, Alice's Crowley as well. And of course, Lothrop Stoddard, talking about America. and then talking about what was the person we mentioned a while ago. So basically, what I'm reviewing specifically in this book, Yockey, right? What I'm actually reviewing in this book is the European New Right with the chief figure Alain de Benoit.
Yeah.
So I'm basically, how can I say, putting things in context a little bit. Like he's certainly a man of great erudition, and he inspired me very much. Not so much with his arsenal, with the content, but rather with his methodology. Because I admire people who have good style and who know very well what their parameters are in terms of their methodology. So I'm reviewing in my book Oswald Spengler,
yes,
a historian. Of course, then when we talk about Oswald Spengler, we'll fit in also Toynbee, who also fits into this quote-unquote new right type of a segment of thought. Yeah. Then I'm dealing very much with Carl Schmitt, who is one of my favorites. He's a great jurist, great lawyer, international lawyer, political scientist. He's certainly a man of actually stunning erudition. I'm devoting a whole chapter to him. Very politically correct, by the way. The whole book was written in a very politically... Because otherwise it wouldn't have been accepted for my doctoral dissertation. And then I'm also dealing with Wilfredo Pareto in political sociology. A great man. And then, of course, in other segments, I'm dealing a little bit with sociobiology, with Gerrit Harden, I'm with Arthur Jensen and Richard Lynn. So again, I need to repeat that for your audience. It's a rather descriptive book.
Can I interrupt you there? Was Jensen the man who discovered or invented the transistor?
No, this was Shockley.
Shockley, yeah.
Shockley, yes.
Shockley,
I think I mentioned him in my book. I'm not quite certain. But anyway, I'm dealing with the thoughts or political thoughts, or call it sociological thoughts, which today are considered in this self-castrating, politically correct language of ours as heretics or as people who are not in core syllabi. And I think they merit that, if for no other reasons, to give a certain balance in this obligatory readings that students are exposed to. And then, of course, I'm dealing also with a segment, in the last segment of my book, with the phenomenon of polytheism and monotheism. And in fact, I must say that one of my major arguments, which I'm basically copying, but not copy-pasting, but just copying from Alain de Benoit and from Nietzsche as well, is that the roots of our crisis go back to Christianity and to monotheism.
So that, of course, is very controversial.
Very controversial issue, and I don't think I feel very comfortable talking about this, but I personally think that if you truly want to understand even the pathology of anti-Semitism, even a different pathology of liberalism or communism, we have to go back, we have to get back into history and look at the monotheism, which for a variety of historical reasons we accepted very early on, in the 5th to the 6th century, in England a little bit later on, which basically changed our whole idea of perception and perception of reality and self-perception.
Let us move on, because we could cover quite a few points here.
Sure.
You've written another most interesting book, Post-Mortem Report. Whose death are we talking about here?
All right. Now, technically, this book represents. It's made up of 4 segments. One segment deals with political philosophy. The other segment deals with contemporary history, or modern historiography. The Second World War, some revisionist issues that I'm also tackling on. And I think the third segment deals with literature and politics and the cultural hegemony. I can't quite, you should probably remind me of it. So basically, these are my collected essays, and I would like to underline, these are the collected essays, most of which were published in a relatively prestigious academic journals in the United States of America in the early 90s. Marx, Moses and the Pagans in the Secular City, where I'm developing this thesis of monotheism versus polytheism, and how in fact monotheism was monotheism. My major point being is that monotheism is at the root of the modern totalitarianism in its secular expression.
Say that again?
That monotheism, the biblical monotheism, the Judaism, the Judaic monotheism, gave birth later on in the 20th century to this modern communist totalitarianism. And I'm developing this with lots of footnotes in German, English, French, and so on. And this piece was published first in the Clio, the Journal of History and Philosophy, in 1994, as far as I'm concerned, as far as I know. And of course, the book also contains some of my pieces that I published in Kevin MacDonald's online journal, Occidental Quarterly, where I'm dealing with race, very much with race and the importance of race, and how, in fact, race I'm dealing also with the etymology of the word race, how in fact race, like even 200 years ago, let alone the concept of race hundreds of years ago, didn't have a negative connotation at all. It was something quite normal. And even I can tell you now, just for the sake of convenience, in the French language until recently, and even in Italian language, you would say for a person even of a good character that he is of good race. Elle est de bonne race, you say for a lady. Elle est de bonne race, which means she's not just good looking, but she is also mentally sound. So again, I do spend quite some time dealing with concepts and with the etymology of words, because in my view, and I guess I stridently insist on it, we have to clarify the concepts, especially in our modernity now, in our TV society, in our digital, our videospheric society. We have to come to terms with those words which we didn't invent, but somebody else invented those words.
In other words, we should take words very seriously, in fact.
Very seriously, but first and foremost, I always ask myself, who defines those words?
Indeed so. Well, that's part of taking the word seriously.
Absolutely. Like, for instance, when I listen to the BBC, and when a person starts blabbling about democracy and tolerance, I first want to know who is the person who defines democracy.
That leads to my next question. In your book, Post-Mortem Report, there's a whole section, you've talked about communism, there's a whole section here entitled Liberalism and Democracy. Would you like to summarise your thoughts on liberalism and democracy? Yes. Western versions? Mm-hmm. Western versions?
Well, I guess, let me put it that way. It's an oxymoron, you know. First and foremost, liberalism... what are the chief values of modern liberalism? Firstly, well, look, I got to back up a little bit. The 19th century liberalism, Tocqueville's liberalism, has nothing to do with the modern neoliberalism of Miliband. What is their minister here in the United States, in the your kingdom, or for that matter, of the bankers here in the UK? So basically, modern liberalism has nothing to do with the original democracy, which means power of the people. If you look at the etymology of the word. Yeah. What we have now, I hate to say that this word has lost its popularity, but this is the word I like using very much. What we have is basically the oligarchy, or rather the plutocracy. We have the government of the rich, the government of the few, the oligarchy being that the government of the few who basically runs the show. We have a representative government, and I myself am against the representative government, because you can't have a government of 300 or 400 people representing a nation state of 70 million people. So by and large, and I'm just taking a wild guess, I certainly would need some empirical example to back it up. By and large, be it the UK politicians or Croat politicians, or be it the congressmen in the United States of America, they've distanced themselves very, very much from their core constituents. And we can see it best in the European Union, the Brussels bureaucrats. What do they know about Wales? What do they know about your troubles or your plights? What do they know about the fishermen in Portugal? Or what do they know about the plight of the weather report in Greece, or so on? So basically, once again, liberal democracy for me is an oxymoron. I think I will use a harsher word. It's a fraud. And to some extent, it seems to me that we have fallen into this trap of this verbiage, which is being constantly used on all wavelengths, 24 hours, by modern quote-unquote liberal Democrats.
So, you are active in the American Third Position. You are promoting your ideas, and in addition to that, in parallel to that, as part of that, you have written a book entitled Homo Americanus.
Right.
What have you got to say about that book?
Well, again, we know about Homo Sovieticus, we know the spirit of communism. I extensively dealt with that in my pieces, in some scholarly pieces. Not just communism as a form of ideology, as a set of belief, or as a legal system or illegal system, but I also dealt with communism as a form of pathology, as a psychological pathology. But then listen, once you are bombarded with the anti-communist slogans, which I quite was when I was in the States, I mean, as an intellectual, at least trying to be one, as an academic, as somebody who is at least trying to develop critical skills as well, I wonder, is there Homo Americanus? Well, most Americans will tell you, no, there are no Homo Americanus. But you know who mentions Homo Americanus? Yockey. He talks about this American spirit very much. And I'm discussing that very much in detail, this Homo Americanus, this Americanism, what exactly Americanism means. And of course I'll take it with all due respect towards me, myself. I'm quoting from Tocqueville to really rabid anti-Americans, some French Americans, anti-Americans, who wrote very critically about the biblical spirit of America, the power of the Bible, the hyper-moralism in the United States, in the U.S. foreign policy. And of course, I'm also developing 2 chapters, I'm backing them up with many, many footnotes, and I'm trying to explain in a rather cogent fashion why, for instance, is the United States so much attached to Israel? Why the United States of America is so keen about supporting Israel? And basically my conclusion is it's not for geopolitical reasons, it's not for financial reasons, it's for metaphysical reasons, it's for political, theological reasons. Because to some extent American politicians, American elites, they conceive themselves as an extension of a chosen people. And again, we
Gentile and Jew.
Gentile. In fact, they made out of Yahweh a certain, not just a name, not just a transcendental figure of God, of goddess, of God, but also a leading line in their foreign policy. Hence this phenomenon that you will quite constantly find in American foreign policy. All the wars they wage, be it during the First World War, be it in Cuba at the beginning of the 20th century, or later on during the First World War, and then in the Second World War, and then later on in Vietnam, Korea, Vietnam, Iraq, and on. And even a person with not much knowledge can realize that those wars carry a great deal of moralistic scheme. They have a very high amount of moralizing verbiage, like, we are the ones who have to make the world better for democracy. We are the ones who have to remove the bad guys from the scene in order to resuscitate this primeval city on the hill, which is again the theme that comes directly from the Old Testament, to keep that in mind. So basically my point is that many Americans, and not just politicians, but many, many Americans, without even being aware of that, have adopted this biblical, Old Testamental type of a mythology, and they've, of course, transposed it in a secular fashion, in our secular world. Like chosen is democracy, we are the best, we are the ones who have to rule forever. And here is the parallel that I'm drawing with the Soviets, because the Soviets and the communists, they also had this mythology. Let's call it eschatology, I'm sure you know what that means, like messianic type of a world. We'll make the world better for democracy once we destroy hundreds of thousands of civilian Germans in a firebombing. We'll make the world safe for democracy once we destroy Iraq and all those bad guys, call them rats and what have you. Well, we'll make the world safe for democracy once we destroy Iran, and I'm just taking a wild guess, or some other countries like Grenada or Panama, what have you. And I consider that a very, very serious problem, which can be traced back again to the Old Testament. Hence the reason that I've always been, despite the fact that I was raised in a Catholic family, and I still consider myself Catholic, but I am very critical towards monotheism, and particularly the Old Testament, but also the New Testament.
Let's just stop one sentence back. You are critical of America. You say that the American power elite launches its military force all over the war for the last 90 years since the First World War.
Even more than
has made a lot of money doing so.
Yes.
Built up enormous political power, but all in terms of a sort of morality. You mentioned that the Soviets also had this idea of bringing that they justified themselves in terms of that they were going to bring perpetual peace to the world and prosperity, a similar parallel but different messianic.
Yes, different, but nonetheless the same telos, the same goal of achieving the best, the better world, no matter what the cost may be, and we know very much what the costs were.
The cost of of wars has been tremendous in trying to establish what one might say is heaven on earth. One might
heaven
say,
on earth, and it turns into a
brought about by secular means. So, you, sir, coming from Eastern Europe, but being fluent in European languages and being a scholar and a diplomat, but having spent most of your adult life in the United States of America, your particular viewpoint is almost very, very rare. You have an ability to look at several worlds which most people hardly can look at their own world with any understanding. But you are in a position, through your experience, painful though it was in your early days,
Sure.
as you described in Croatia under the communists, under Tito. You've talked about Homo Sovieticus. You've talked about Homo Americanus. We have seen the Soviet Union collapse 20 years ago. This mighty military power collapse. Would you like to give a forecast of the United States of America? How you think it may go? Would you like to do that? I'm inviting you.
Well, sure, but look, there is something called wishful thinking or self-fulfilling prophecy.
Well, no, we can't fulfill any prophecy.
I'll tell you quite frankly, first and foremost, I have to make a disclaimer. I chose to be an American, so I certainly consider myself a true American, and I hate to say that I have more friends in the United States of America, and of course I have a nostalgia, especially for people in the South. Having said that, it doesn't mean that I'm not aware of the fact that there is something terribly going on, especially in the higher echelons of power in the United States of America. And first and foremost, I reject this ideology of big bucks, the ideology of money, the ideology of good life. And I think the America is making the same mistake as the Soviet Union. It's solely based on this ideology of progress.
Yeah.
Many conservative scholars have written about this. Thomas Molnar, I'm quoting them in my book Homo Americanus. They wrote about this ideology of progress constantly, that you have to make the world better for democracy, better for economic growth, and so on and so forth. Now, in terms of projecting look, we often assume from the layman's position that countries fall apart because of the barbarians who attack them, or let's say in this particular specific case because millions of illegals have come to the United States of America, that they're destroying America from within. I myself, I wouldn't give them so much credit. Yeah. If I can just make a little digression, even when they talk about some putative Islamic threat, I would take a certain amount of reserve towards that. A friend of mine told me that, was from Paris. Well, he told me the other day, look, Tom, the Muslims are not capable of invading Jerusalem and of capturing Jerusalem. How do you think that they're going to invade, Europe? But of course, there are different means they can use. They can use demography. They don't have to fight with a sword. They can fight with our babies and so on. But that's a different ballgame. Now, as far as the United States is concerned, I don't think there will be some major riot or so on. But the country is definitely collapsing from within because of the sheer greed and materialism, because of this banking system, which is not of a superficial level. It's a structural level. It has a structural level. Now, the one good thing, if you can follow my logic, Americanism or capitalism. I'm using Americanism as a symbol of capitalism because it's the ideal type of capitalism. It could hide its deficiencies, its abnormalities, we can say, its pathologies during the Cold War behind the screen of anti-communism. And then at that time in the 60s and 70s, my dad, myself, my cat, my dog, we were all very much pro-Americans in communist Yugoslavia and communist Eastern Europe, because indeed America for us was the only solution against the arrested history in that part of Europe. We thought that the history will never move away, that we'll have communists for ages and for eons and eons. So we all thought, well, the good GIs will come and beat the asses of those bad communist guys. And it didn't happen. The system fell apart from within. And now what we have, the American elites, and I'm not just specifically elites, I'm not into this conspiracy theories, because I think conspiracy theory is a form of stupid reductionism. You can quote me on that. I don't like reductionism in scholarship. Of course, there might be some conspirators, but they don't govern the world. It's rather our self-delusions that govern the world. America is nowadays, the American system per se, in the position where it can no longer hide behind the screen of anti-communism. Now they've come, with this passing, this passing anti-Islamic threat, Al-Qaeda and so on and so forth, which of course I cannot debate about as to what extent this is true or not. But you wonder sometimes, and this terribly reminds me of communism. The communists always needed bad guys in order to legitimize their system, the functioning of their system. And now we have more or less the same type of a self-defeating, self-denial within the United States of America. So by and large, I will quote Pat Buchanan, whom I had the pleasure to meet twice, I think that America is in the process of balkanization, and I'm not ruling out that the country may just turn out to be something else from what it is in a very radical fashion in the years to come. How it's going to look like, I have no idea.
Should we stop at that point? I think the others want to go. That's a good point to stop on, I think.
Thank you.
You've painted it black,
Yes.
but you said you don't know.
Yes.
And
thank
you've
you.
quoted Pat Buchanan, a hero.
Yes,
He's a
yeah.
great man.
It's a great man.
A great man.
Thank you very much, Steve. I appreciate it.